Alright, so we're going to go over lesson 9 right now, and it's over angle relationships. So this lesson is pretty short and sweet, but there's a lot of important terminology in this lesson, so we need to make sure we go over it pretty well. So, the I can statements are, I can use angle relationships, aka vertical, adjacent, linear pair, complementary, supplementary, and bisected to solve problems. So, let's start off with an easy one. Let's go back and see what an angle is. An angle is a figure formed by two rays that share a common endpoint called the vertex of the angle. Right here are a few of the different kinds of pairs we're going to look at. We have complementary, adjacent, supplementary, and vertical. We'll go into what those are, but just to kind of give you a heads up as to what we're going to look at. So, vertical angles are ones that are probably some of the easiest to see and use, but people tend to forget what they are sometimes. So, vertical angles are each of the pair of opposite angles made by two intersecting lines. Their measures are congruent, which means they have the same number of degrees. So what that means is in this figure here, we have two lines that cross each other. So the angles formed on opposite sides, those are vertical angles. Those will always have the same measure. This angle and this angle are also vertical angles. So they'll be the same. So if this A was, say, 80 degrees, this would be 80 degrees as well. And if this was 100 degrees, well, then so would this be. All right, so let's practice this example here. So it wants us to find what the measure of angle X is. So we have two lines forming an X, and we have these two angles on opposite sides. So we have 133 degrees here, so that means that X should be 133 degrees as well. So it's as simple as that. Alright, so for adjacent angles are two angles that have a common side and a common vertex, and they don't overlap. So an example is this right here. This is an angle, and this is an angle. So they each share, let's grab a different color. They both share this ray. They both share the side. And they both meet at this point here. Because they're touching, they're adjacent. So this is an example of an adjacent angle. Angle A is against angle B. There's not really anything guaranteed about their measures, other than we can add A and B to get the whole thing, but that's about it. So let's look at linear pairs. So a linear pair is a special type of adjacent angle. So as you know, adjacent angles, it's two angles that are side by side. This is a special kind. These angles form a straight angle, which if you remember is basically just a straight line. And because they're a straight line, their measures will always be supplementary, which means add up to 180 degrees. So basically a linear pair are two angles that are against each other that make a straight line. So if we add this angle together, make a straight line, and if I were just to get rid of all this up here, and just look at this, there'd be a line. So looking at this here, let's say that angle 1 is equal to 60 degrees. Let's say we want to find what angle 2 is. Well, if we know this is a linear pair is 180 degrees. So if we subtract what we know, which is the 60 degrees here, we're left with 120 degrees, which means angle 2 is equal to 120 degrees.
Thank you all very much.
And that's all we have to do. Now, complementary angles, this is one of two types of angles that get confused a lot. So complementary angles are two or more angles whose measures add up to 90 degrees. But you look here, the angles don't have to be touching. It could be this 27-degree angle and the 63-degree angle. They add up to 90, so they're complementary. Though most of the time, we'll see things like this, where they're side by side. These two angles, 30 and 60 degrees, add up to 90 degrees. Just two or more angles which add up to 90 degrees. Usually going to be two, but just remember, complementary angles, 90 degrees. Now, the counterpart to a complementary angle, which we'll get to that because never mind. All right, so if these are complementary angles, which means they add up to 90 degrees, and we know that this is 34 degrees, subtract this, and we get 56 degrees. So x is equal to 56 degrees. All these problems are pretty straightforward and simple for now. All right, so supplementary angles are the counterpart to complementary. When two or more angles there are two or more angles whose measures add up to 180 degrees. So the difference here is that they add up to 180 degrees. Other than that, they're basically the same. They don't have to touch like this pair here, or they can touch like this pair here. If they do touch and they add to 180 degrees, they're called a linear pair. They all kind of connect. So remember, complementary angles, I go back, keep going back, keep going, and more. Complementary angles add up to 90 degrees. Supplementary angles add up to 180 degrees. That's an important distinction you'll need to remember. So, if we know that this pair here is supplementary, that means they add to 180 degrees. If this right here is all we've got to work with, then we subtract 180 by that value there, which is 79. And that gives us 101, which means that this missing angle has to be 101 degrees. Now, the last pair we're going to talk about are called bisected angles. So, bisected angles are angles that are divided into two equal halves by an angle bisector, or an additional ray. The two halves are the same measures. The two halves have the same measure, which is half of the measure of the original angle. So here's just a couple examples. Here's the bisector, and here's the bisecting ray. If you remember back to line segments, we had a perpendicular bisector, which cut it in half. This word bisected just means to cut in half. So if we know that these cut in half, then whatever this measure is, this one has to be as well. So let's take a look at this next example. So if this is a bisected angle, and this is 65 degrees, then this missing one has to be 65 degrees. And what does the entire angle equal? Well, using the angle addition postulate from lesson 7, I believe, we add 65 and 65. And that gives us a total of 130 degrees. That's supposed to be 0. I'm going to erase that. So if there's any of these that you feel like you need to go over again, just rewind the video, rewatch that section, or email me if you need some specific help, and we can go through it together. All of these are pretty simple and straightforward. It's just there's a lot of it. Just focus one at a time. Just focus on your vertical angles. Make sure you know what they are. Go on to adjacent, linear, complementary, supplementary, and bisected. If you can go through all those,